At midnight on the 5th of February, 2026, the last treaty limiting the world's two largest nuclear arsenals quietly expired. There was no successor, there was no negotiation underway. For the first time since 1972, the United States and Russia faced each other with no binding limit on their strategic nuclear weapons, and almost no one noticed. But here is what I want to argue in this analysis, and it cuts against almost everything you'll hear about the new nuclear age. The danger we're entering is not that China has become a third nuclear superpower. China is nowhere near that. The real danger is something quieter, and far more destabilizing. I'm Dr. Naim Tahir Baig, and this is the end of arms control in a tripolar world. We'll do this in 3 moves. First, the force numbers, and why the word tripolar is misleading. Second, a model, why adding a third nuclear power doesn't just complicate deterrence, it can break it. And third, a harder question, does instability at the center spread to the edges, to Iran, to Korea, to Europe? I'll stress test my own argument against its strongest critics, and I'll show you the one piece of evidence that suggests I'm wrong. Let's begin. Start with what actually happened. New START limited each side to 1,550 deployed strategic warheads on 700 delivery vehicles. In 2023, Russia suspended the part of the treaty that mattered most, the verification regime, the on-site inspections, the data exchanges. Then in February 2026, the whole treaty lapsed. Now, here's the subtle part. The numbers didn't change overnight. Both sides, on open source evidence, are still sitting near the old limits. What vanished was not the weapons. What vanished was the ability to see, the verification, the predictability, the institutional dialogue. Hold that thought, because it's the hinge of everything that follows. Now the numbers themselves. At the start of 2025, Russia held roughly 5,400 warheads, the United States roughly 5,200. Together, close to 90% of every nuclear weapon on Earth. And China, about 600, growing fast, roughly 100 a year since 2023, the fastest expansion of any nuclear state. But look at that gap. China's arsenal is about 1/11th the size of either rival's. Even if Beijing hits its maximum projected figure, 1,500 warheads by 2035, that's still only about a third of what the US or Russia holds today. So here's the contradiction that honest analysis has to confront, not dodge. If China is this far behind, not a peer, not close, then in what sense is this a three-power world at all? Why is everyone using the word tripolar? The lazy answer is to wave at China's growth and move on. The better answer requires rethinking what polarity actually means. Polarity was never really about equality of arsenals. It's about the number of independent actors whose decisions you must account for in your own planning. And by that definition, something decisive has changed. For decades, the United States planned against one nuclear peer. Now, once China's arsenal is merely large enough to survive a first strike and retaliate, Washington must size and posture its forces against two independent decision-makers, two centers that, given the Russia-China alignment, might act together. That's the shift, not parity, independence. I call it asymmetric tripolarity, a 2.5 power problem. Two large poles, and a third, smaller, but strategically independent one whose mere existence breaks the old two-body logic. But I have to be honest about timing, because this is where careful analysis earns its trust. China has not indisputably crossed this threshold. The case that it hasn't is real. Most Chinese warheads are reportedly stored separately from their missiles, which on its face means they could be destroyed before they're ever mated and launched. So why do I still make this argument? Because 3 developments are changing the survivability picture, roughly 300 new ICBM silos, which multiply the targets an attacker must hit, a maturing submarine-based force, which is far harder to destroy, and a move toward launch on warning. My claim is therefore conditional and dated. China clears the survivable second strike threshold around the turn of the decade, 2027 to 2030, not today. This is an argument about where we're heading, stated as a transition in progress. Now let me put the strongest objection to my own thesis. A serious body of scholarship argues that China has spent 60 years deliberately keeping the smallest force that can still threaten unacceptable retaliation, and that today's build-up is just raising the minimum, restoring survivability, not racing for parity. If that's right, China stays a junior partner forever, and my 2.5 power framing collapses. Here's why the argument survives anyway. My case doesn't require parity. It doesn't require a war-fighting doctrine. It requires only one thing, a survivable, independent second strike, which is exactly what the minimum deterrent school says China is now securing. A minimum deterrent China that has achieved survivability is still a third decision center that American counterforce can no longer disarm. The two theories aren't in conflict. The system can be tripolar even if China never comes close to parity. Which brings us to the heart of the analysis, and to the metaphor that US Strategic Command itself reached for. They called the new nuclear predicament a three-body problem. In physics, the three-body problem is famous. Two orbiting bodies can be solved exactly, but add a third and the system has no general clean solution. It must be continuously, actively stabilized. The political version has the same character. Now, the classic theorists disagreed about whether more powers means more danger. Kenneth Waltz argued bipolarity is the most stable arrangement. With only two great powers, each can focus entirely on the other. Deutsch and Singer argued the opposite for multipolarity, more actors dilute any single rivalry. But, and this is the key, their optimistic case depended on one condition, that the alignments be fluid and cross-cutting. Our emerging system fails that condition exactly. Two of the three poles, Russia and China, are aligned. That turns the structure into the rigid, block-like configuration that both theories agree is dangerous. The optimist and the pessimist converge on the same warning. Deterrence theory makes this concrete. Two-sided deterrence rests on a clean idea. Each side keeps enough surviving force to retaliate, so striking first is irrational. The stabilizer is symmetry of mutual vulnerability. Add a third player and that fractures in two ways. First, the requirement multiplies. To deter two independent adversaries who might act together, you must keep enough force surviving to retaliate against both after absorbing a strike. Net assessments conclude that doing that against both China and Russia at once, at current force levels, may simply be infeasible. Second, the escalation ladder loses its single dimension. The Cold War imagined one ladder, one opponent. With three actors, a crisis in one place reshapes the incentives everywhere else, a Taiwan crisis changes the European balance, and the reverse. There's no longer one ladder. There's an interacting field. Let me give this an actual mechanism, because I don't want to assert instability, I want to derive it. Picture three powers. A is the United States. B and C are the two aligned poles, Russia and China. The thing that does all the work is a single dial I'll call ρ, the degree of coupling between B and C when ρ is 0, they're fully independent. A crisis with one says nothing about the other. When ρ is 1, they're perfectly coupled, C acts with B, or exploits America's distraction. Now, what retaliation must the United States anticipate if it ever considered striking one of them? Not just B's surviving force, but B's force plus ρ times C's. The higher the coupling, the more of the second adversary's arsenal gets added to the ledger. That's the whole idea in one line. Here's the move that matters. Most analysis treats that coupling as a fixed fact. It isn't, it responds, and that's what makes the system dynamic and dangerous. Suppose the United States invests in counterforce and missile defense to limit the damage it would suffer. What do Russia and China do? They tighten their coordination, pool early warning, synchronize, precisely to defeat that damage limitation. So American defense raises the coupling. The higher coupling raises the American defensive requirement. And around it goes. This is no longer a simple action-reaction race between two states. It's coupled feedback, a loop that can feed on itself. Now watch what determines whether that loop settles down or runs away, because it comes down to one thing: information. On the left, verification is intact. The United States can see the true size of the surviving forces, so it calibrates its response to reality, it doesn't over-insure. The loop settles at a stable, bounded level of coupling. Uncomfortable, but not running away. This is conditional stability. On the right, verification is gone. Now the United States can't see the real numbers, so it must plan against the worst case. Every increment of suspected coupling triggers a large response. And mathematically, the loop crosses a threshold, the stable point becomes a repelling one. Small disturbances no longer settle, they amplify, driving coordination and counterforce upward together until the system pins to the maximum. The arms race doesn't converge. It runs to the boundary. That is the precise, technical sense in which I claim the most dangerous loss is informational, not numerical. Losing the weapons count didn't tip the system. Losing the ability to see did. Two honesties keep this from overreaching. First, this is a result about slopes, not destiny. If Russia and China can't or won't coordinate, or if transparency is restored, the loop settles on the stable branch. The model contains both outcomes as regions of the same parameter space, and it tells you the two dials that move you between them: transparency and the ease of adversary coordination. Second, the model is deliberately minimal. One dimension, no alliances, no conventional forces. It demonstrates a mechanism, not a precise magnitude. It shows that the runaway is a derivable consequence of two reasonable assumptions plus the loss of transparency, not just an intuition I'm asking you to share. And this isn't abstract. In January 2025, the United States ordered a homeland missile defense program, eventually called Golden Dome, explicitly aimed beyond rogue states at peer and near-peer adversaries. The strategic stability literature has warned for 50 years that defending the homeland against a peer is destabilizing, because it threatens that peer's ability to retaliate, inviting them to build more to saturate the shield. That's the ABM treaty logic. And right on cue, in May 2025, during Xi's visit to Moscow, China and Russia jointly condemned the program by name as deeply destabilizing. That joint statement is the coupling parameter made visible. A US defensive move pushed the two adversaries to respond together, raising Rho in real time. The competition then bleeds into space, cyber, anti-satellite weapons, all the systems that could blind early warning and compress decision time. That's why, when we get to policy, the priority won't be warhead caps. It'll be protecting the systems that let everyone see. The third part of this analysis I want to flag carefully, because intellectual honesty means telling you which of my claims is strong and which is tentative. The first two parts, the reframing and the model, are the load-bearing argument. This third part is a conjecture. I'll hold it to a lower standard, and I'll show you where it fails. The conjecture is this: that visible erosion of restraint at the center of the system raises the salience of nuclear weapons at its edges, among threshold states and allies. Take the obvious test case, the 12-day Israel-Iran war of June 2025, ending with American strikes on Iran's nuclear sites. Does that prove instability is spreading from the center? No, and here I have to concede the strongest objection against myself. Iran's nuclear ambitions have their own causes: the collapse of the 2015 deal, the rivalry with Israel, regime survival, none of which depend on a US-Russia treaty lapsing. To claim Iran's program is a downstream effect of new START's end would be to mistake coincidence for cause. So the Iran case cannot confirm the strong version of my conjecture. What it can support is something weaker and more defensible: that the permissive environment, the political and normative cost of going nuclear, is set by how the major powers behave, and that cost is falling. The strongest lesson of the Iran strikes isn't about Iran. It's the lesson observers draw. Our non-nuclear state was struck, its conventional deterrent exposed, and others may conclude that only a weapon would have deterred that. The conjecture finds firmer footing not in Iran but among America's allies, though even here I'll keep the language careful, because the war in Ukraine is a confounding cause I can't fully separate out. South Korea is the strongest case. Survey data show public support for an indigenous bomb staying high even when trust in the American guarantee is strong, driven by anticipation of US decline, not present distrust. Japan is more subtle, and read honestly, it cuts the other way on demand. Large majorities still back the non-nuclear principles. What's changed in Japan is that the question moved from the fringe into the cabinet, more discussable, not more popular. And Europe, the Polish Prime Minister saying on the record that Poland would be safer with its own arsenal, Britain and France, for the first time, agreeing to coordinate their nuclear forces. The pattern across all of them: nuclear salience is rising during the period of central erosion. That corroborates the conjecture. It doesn't, by itself, prove the cause. Let me now put the two most serious counterarguments to the whole thesis. First, maybe tripolarity is tolerable, even more stable than a two-power world. If all three keep a survivable retaliatory force and none seeks to disarm the others, mutual vulnerability holds and the very complexity induces caution. My answer: that case is conditional on exactly what we've lost. Self-stabilization requires each side to correctly perceive the other's restraint, and verification, the thing that made restraint legible, is gone. So I'll concede the framing: tripolarity isn't inherently unstable. It's conditionally stable, and the danger is that we've removed the conditions. Second counterargument: If the American guarantee is decaying, why not manage Allied proliferation? Let democratic allies get their own deterrence. My answer: even if the end state was stable, the path runs through windows of acute vulnerability. New, unsecured arsenals invite exactly the preventive strike the Iran case showed. And each acquisition lowers the bar for the next. Forestalling Allied proliferation isn't just preferable to managing it, it's load-bearing. So what actually follows for policy? 4 steps, and notice the order, from most to least achievable, none requiring a single ratified treaty. 1. Information before numbers. The United States and Russia should restore voluntary data exchange and a consultative channel, even without a treaty. Flatten the worst-case guessing. 2. Trilateral risk reduction with China, not warhead caps Beijing will refuse, but crisis communication links and norms against attacking nuclear command and control and early warning systems. 3. Reinforce extended deterrence, deepen consultation with allies so reassurance is satisfied at the lower rungs, before hedging hardens into a weapons program. 4. Steward the NPT regime through the 2026 review conference. Notice the through line: transparency before numbers, risk reduction before caps. The target of policy is the informational loss, because that's what the model identified as load-bearing. Now I owe you something that most analysis never offers, the single best piece of evidence that I'm wrong. Here it is. My model says that once verification is gone, each side must assume the worst and the race should begin to run. But in reality, despite Russia suspending verification in 2023, despite the treaty fully expiring in 2026, both sides have held near the old limits. No breakout. That's not a straw man. It's a real datum against my logic, and it's exactly what the optimists predicted. Why doesn't it overturn the thesis? 3 reasons, and the third is a genuine concession. First, my instability is about the slope of responses near a tipping point, not today's force levels. Calm now says little about how sharply each side would react to a future shock. Second, the dangerous window is the China transition of 2027 to 2030. It hasn't arrived yet. And third, the concession: if that restraint persists through the transition, with no breakout even as China's force matures and verification stays absent, then habit and tacit reciprocity will have substituted for the legibility my model treats as essential, and I will have been wrong. I don't have an answer the next 5 years won't supply. This is the indicator most worth watching. One last honesty, and then the conclusion. I've spent this analysis mourning the loss of bipolar stability, so I should ask whether that stability was ever real. The record counsels humility. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Abel Archer, in 1983, when a NATO exercise nearly triggered a Soviet first strike. That same year, a single Soviet officer chose to treat a satellite warning as the false alarm it was, and may have prevented a launch. The honest baseline isn't stability. It's survival, under recurrent, sometimes accidental, risk. But notice, every one of those near misses happened within a single pair, often turning on one warning system read by one chain of command. A 3-body system, with coupled feedback across multiple theaters, multiplies exactly those conditions: compressed time, ambiguous warning, worst-case inference, and the instruments that at least made behavior legible are now gone. So the correction doesn't rescue optimism. It relocates the worry. We haven't lost a stable order. We've lost the legibility that helped a never-stable order survive. The 3-body problem has no clean solution, but its bodies can still be actively stabilized. The task, for scholarship and for statecraft, is to make sure that the end of arms control does not become the end of restraint. I'm Naim Tahir Baig. Thank you for thinking this through with me.